Welcome. You are listening to Haunted Histories on Paranormal UK Radio. Hello everybody and welcome to this episode of Haunted Histories exclusively on Paranormal UK Radio. How is everyone doing? Well, I'm actually in Essex, so I am one of the new ones who've got some new restrictions placed on them because of the horrible virus that's going around. I'm not going to complain about any of it because I know, I understand the reasons we're doing it, but it's just one of those things. So a bit more reading and research for me rather than being out investigating. What have you thought of the podcast we've been doing this year? I'd say I've really enjoyed all the different things I've had to research and learn about, whether it be for the podcast, whether it be for the various blogs I've written, whether it be for the Haunted magazine articles. It's been a very fascinating year full of lots of learning. But if you can't get out of the house and you're looking for something to do, don't forget that on the weekend, the 24th to 25th of October, you've got the Festival of the Unexplained taking place. It's a free, well, I call it a paramarathon, if you like. There's going to be something like 30 odd hours of interviews, of presentations. And yes, yours truly is going to be on there doing one. I think the guest list is pretty, I'm pretty intimidated by the guest list. You've got the wonderful Mr. Nick Groff. You've got the lovely Mr. I can't even speak now, Mr. Richard Estep. You've got my good friend as well, Wes Coleman. You've got Jane Harris. You've got Phil and Sarah Wyme. Oh, the list is... Go and dig them out on Facebook because it's going to be a brilliant event. Now, we are joined today by a lovely chap, and we've already been talking for nearly an hour about all things history and military and various other things. And I think he's been testing me to see if I really have read his book. It's the wonderful Mr. Mark Egerton from Huntingdonshire.
Hello, Penny.
You were testing me to see if I'd read your book, weren't you?
No, I wasn't. I didn't doubt you at all.
Well, for those of you who don't know, Mark is actually the author of a book called The Haunted History of Huntingdonshire. And I really have trouble saying that, so if I stumble over the words, I do apologise. And we were talking through some of the accounts, and it's really... it does cover the whole of... I mean, it's not an official county anymore, is it? Is it a district of...
Yes, it's Huntingdonshire was a county, Penny, and then it became a district and was absorbed into Cambridgeshire. It's basically called Huntingdonshire still, but it's a district, and it makes up about 25% of what is now Cambridgeshire. Right.
And does it sort of go into sort of Bedfordshire as well, sort of thing?
It's quite interesting because the borders have moved. The sort of most southerly part of it is a place called Eton Soken, which borders Bedfordshire. Mm-hmm. And at one time, Eton Soken was part of Bedfordshire, but I think around about the 70s, they moved the borders around again, mm-hmm. and Eton Soken became part of Huntingdonshire, which then was absorbed into Cambridgeshire, if you can follow that.
Yeah, just about. Now, you're you're a local lad, aren't you?
Yeah, I was born in Huntingdon.
Yeah, born and raised.
Yeah.
We were talking about attractions to places that you've never lived before, and I know yours is Liverpool, and I was saying mine was North Yorkshire, and we were talking about the various reasons why we think that might be the case, which, to do with past relatives and maybe the pull of them taking you back. But as a and I'll call it Huntingdon, even though I mean the area in general. As a Huntingdon lad, what kind of interest have you had in the history of the place? Because you run a page called Haunted History, so you're obviously a bit into history. You and I were discussing you did a history A level when you were a lad, so you've obviously got an interest in it. But what is it about your home, if you like, not your home, because we'll get onto that one, but what is it about your homeland, if you like, history, that fascinates you so much?
Well, really, I explained to you earlier, I got into the paranormal at a very sort of tender age. I was a teenager, and I wasn't old enough to drive, and so anything paranormal I could only really get to in the relatively small area, which was Huntingdonshire at that time.
Yeah.
And so my mother's sister, who I spoke to you about over the years, she kept badgering me to write a book. She said, you know more about Huntingdonshire's ghosts, myths and legends than most people, and a book's never been written on it. So she passed away in 2009 of cancer, and we had a very lot of heart-to-heart telephone calls, and I didn't actually promise I'd write the book, but I more or less did. I didn't start it until 2015.
Yeah.
It took me about 2 years because it's quite a big book.
Yeah. Yeah. So what is your favourite myth? That I'm not talking about ones, because one of the things we were talking about off air is that one of the things with your book is you don't talk about myths unless you can find someone who has either got personal experience of it or a deceased relative had personal experience of it. But what is your favourite one that is just a myth or a legend that you've never been able to corroborate with a first-hand witness?
Well, probably I would opt in that case for a place called the Ferry Boat Inn, which is in an area called Needingworth, which was certainly one of Huntingdonshire's oldest ghost stories. And this is an anniversary haunting. It happens, or allegedly happens, on March the 17th. A young girl called Juliet Tuesley, whose grave is apparently beneath this public house. There's a flagstone there definitely to mark her grave, and on the 17th of March, which is supposed to be the anniversary of her death, she is said to rise up from her grave and walk down to the nearby river, where in the 1100s, I can't remember the exact date off the top of my head, she is said to have taken her own life. She basically fell in love with a woodcutter called Tom Zool, and he spurned her. She made her feelings known, and in her grief, she allegedly went down to the riverside and hung herself from a tree. So this sort of anniversary haunting, certainly all my adult life, it's a yearly occurrence, and to some degree it still happens. People still go there. But when I researched the book, I found in the archives of Huntingdon Library that her name, Juliet Tuesley, and all the facts relating to this story came from a séance which was conducted in there in 1952 by a guy, quite a famous paranormal researcher called Tony Cornell, who was Cambridge educated. And Tony investigated it thoroughly and came to the conclusion that the information that had been gleaned from a séance he conducted was in fact nonsense. I was lucky enough to be able to find the transcripts of that séance in the archives at Huntingdon Library. So they're published in the book word for word. He sort of concluded that the name Juliet is of Scandinavian origin, and probably, he felt wouldn't have been in England at that time. And he sort of spoke to all the elderly people at that time in the 1950s who'd lived in and around Needingworth all their life, and asked them if anyone had seen this Juliet Tuesley or knew anybody that had. And he drew an absolute blank, and it was quite funny because in the records, these were the days in the 1950s where pubs shut at 11 o'clock. So he went in there to do this séance and got permission, but when it got to 11, the landlord said, "I've got to shut." And they had to close down the séance and carry it on in a hotel in Cambridge, which is about 18 miles from there, called the Blue Boar Hotel, which still exists, I think. So, yeah, very, very strange to do a séance and sort of stop, have half time and carry on the second half elsewhere.
Well, it just, if they're talking to the same spirit, I suppose it does answer one question: do spirits travel?
Yeah.
I remember reading that story, and I must admit the Juliet thing. I always thought Juliet was French, the name, but maybe it wasn't. But then even with the Scandinavian link, it's possible because the Scandinavians were in Britain before the Normans.
Well, the Vikings, weren't they?
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, exactly. So it's certainly possible, but maybe it is just it's a nice story. Well, it's not really a nice story because a girl killing herself because a bloke wasn't interested in her is never nice, no matter when it happens. But I do remember reading that one. It was I was quite engrossed in that one. But when we come to the sort of Huntingdon area, it has got some very famous names associated with it. I mean, one of them, we'll start off I can't even speak today. It's really good for a podcast host, isn't it? Chronologically, Catherine of Aragon. Now, I'm very sorry for Catherine of Aragon. I think she was really, the amount of time she was with Henry, she was really, all right, she wasn't beheaded. She was fortunate in that respect, but she was given a bum deal, really, wasn't she?
Well, as I said, I'm not really a historian, but when I did the research on that story, because she was originally married to his older brother.
His brother, and when he died, yeah.
And the marriage only lasted a matter of months and apparently was never consummated. But
that was actually the argument that Henry used with the church, because he wasn't really supposed to marry his, and I haven't double checked the technical wording for all this, but supposedly there is something in the Bible that says you don't go, I'm paraphrasing here, you don't go for your brother's wife.
Yeah.
And his argument was, well, they never consummated it, so therefore he wasn't really her wife.
Yeah.
No, wasn't really his wife, sorry, so therefore it's fine. But they were together a long time. They were.
I think, don't quote me on this because this is just off the top of my head, I think it was about 29 years.
Something like that, yeah,
an enormous amount of time.
Yeah.
And most people don't realise that, Catherine was his first of 6.
Yep.
And if you add all the other 5 together, the amount of time they spent with Henry is less than with Catherine.
Yeah.
And he obviously wanted a divorce from her, and he used the pretense that she couldn't provide him with a son. I think she actually gave him about 5 or 6 children, and but there was only Mary, who we call Bloody Mary, who actually survived infancy.
Who actually has links to Essex. He has actually strong links to Essex in Chelmsford, where I live as well. But they now think that maybe he had a condition which meant male heirs couldn't survive. There was something in his blood or something, But so Catherine put up with him for quite a long time. She got him from, she got him to become a king. She taught him. She was with him, but then when he decided that he wanted Ms. Boleyn and he wanted to get rid of Catherine, he palmed her off.
Yeah.
And what was the name of the towers? The first place he sent her.
Well, she was moved around to various places, and basically he wanted a divorce, and the Pope wouldn't grant it.
Yeah.
Obviously, the Catholic religion didn't believe in divorce, and she ended up at a place called Buckton Towers, which looks like something out of a Harry Potter film, and it's literally 2 miles from where I sit now, to the north of where I am. Mm-hmm. And Catherine was there for roughly around 10 months. And what a lot of people didn't realise was Catherine was actually a very skilled lace maker.
Yeah.
She was very well loved all throughout her life. And she became really popular because she taught the Buckton people how to make lace, which gave them a trade and an income.
Yep.
And Henry didn't like this, and so he decided to get the Duke of Norfolk and the Duke of Suffolk to move her to a place called Kimbolton Castle, which is about 12 miles to the west of me. Yeah. And they basically turned up to move her, and the locals rebelled and said, "You're not having her. Henry doesn't want her. We do." And these two dukes had to go back to London with their tails beneath their legs. And eventually Henry came back with a larger body of men, and she was moved to Kimbolton, which is where she died. And she is said to haunt Kimbolton Castle. She was there for about 2 years. Very unhappy time. Henry wouldn't visit her. He wouldn't allow Mary to visit her. And the cause of her death remains uncertain. A lot of people think it was the harsh Fenland climate, but most people's opinion it was a form of cancer. And she died on the 7th of January 1536, if I remember rightly. And she was buried at Peterborough Cathedral, which is just north of Huntingdonshire. And it's, to this day, I think it's the last Saturday in January, they have a service for her, and people turn up, and she was called the Pomegranate Princess. I don't know if you knew that.
No.
Yes, she basically, the pomegranate, ironically, was associated with fertility in Spain, which is obviously Aragon, where she came from. And so she became known as the Pomegranate Princess before she married. And so people at Buckton Towers around the time of her death, in the beautiful knot garden there, put pomegranates there, and her tomb at Peterborough Cathedral, which you can Google on Google Images and see. You might find on some of those pictures there'll be pomegranates all over it. And they have this festival the last Saturday in January every year for her. She was well loved everywhere she went.
Which Henry wouldn't have liked, because it took the focus off him. The next person that we're going to mention is he's one that creates a big divide in historians' opinions of him.
I'm going to talk Oliver Cromwell here, aren't you?
We are, yes. You've just spoilt my surprise there, Mark. I'm not sure what my opinion is of him. I've never studied that side of that time in history enough to have an opinion. But yes, Oliver Cromwell.
Yeah, Cromwell is fascinating. Yeah.
Now, he was born in the county, wasn't he? He's from the county. His family.
We were born a mile apart, Cromwell and I.
Really? Is that why you feel such an affinity to him?
I didn't write that in my book, but I was born in Primrose Lane Hospital in Huntingdon, which no longer exists. And his family home was in Huntingdon High Street. It later became a clinic, and I think it's an old people's home now, but it's in the actual High Street of Huntingdon itself, and there's about a mile between the two destinations.
Because what he always used to sort of say, and again, I'm paraphrasing this rather than quoting, is that he might have looked like he came from money, but he didn't really have any. No,
I mean, they weren't a poor family, but they were by no means very rich. He came into riches a little bit later on. To be honest, he wasn't really anybody until he was in his 40s. And there are 3 locations within a stone's throw of Huntingdon Market Square that I mention in the book, which he's allegedly supposed to haunt. I could find evidence of paranormal activity, but I couldn't find any definitive evidence that it's Cromwell. And so I've got a book on Huntingdonshire, and there isn't a Cromwell ghost in there. Well, not one. I've mentioned him, but I couldn't find any evidence that it's a Cromwell haunting. And if you look around England, there's possibly about 15 locations. And again, I think there's only one in Norfolk that's got any credibility, and I can't remember the name of that. Sure. You may know it.
I know he's meant to, there's some in Hertfordshire he's meant to frequent that were some of his bases during the...
I might be completely wrong here, but is Blickling Hall in Norfolk?
It is, yeah.
Well, I think that was a place where he had allegedly, in his youth, before he was famous, had a bit of thing for a young girl who lived there. And years later, somebody said that they recognised him from a portrait on the stairs of Blickling. But it's very, very vague. And I mean, when he was there, he was probably in his teens. and he didn't sort of rise to prominence until he was 40 odd.
Yeah.
He lived and grew up in Huntingdon, and then he moved to St Ives, which is in Huntingdonshire.
Yeah.
And he was just a farmer, and he was there for about 5 years. And they're not really sure exactly where he lived because he wasn't anybody famous.
Yeah.
And then he got an inheritance, and he came into some properties. One of them was a house in Ely, which is probably 200 metres from the Ely Cathedral.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when he moved to Ely, he'd gone outside of Huntingdonshire and was now in Cambridgeshire, so he could stand to be an MP for Cambridge, which is what he did and where his political career began.
Now, the reason that a lot of people are sort of a bit divided on him is he was a Puritan, very much so a Puritan. And, you know, I know you posted on Facebook recently that you were going to be like Cromwell and ban Christmas.
Yes.
And it wasn't so much that he banned Christmas, he just found it sacrilegious to sort of, you know, and they demanded that shops were open on Christmas Day and all that kind of thing. And I'm thinking, no, we haven't really changed much 400 years later, have we? We've got the people who want them open and the people who don't. But, you know, I sometimes think from the studying I have done, his mind was in the right place because Charles I was, you know.
Yes, I mean he was opposed to the monarchy being able to make the rules without being able to tax the people as they were doing,
and then spend all the money,
taking the money and doing whatever they wanted with it. So he was all for having a parliament where people could represent the people and the money could be spent accordingly. Of course, that went completely against the grain with Charles I, and that's where all it happened. Getting back to him, you know, the idea of giving people a voice, I think, was very, very good. And that's what our Parliament is based on and why his statue is outside of Parliament. But, I mean, he did some atrocious things, particularly in Ireland. These were basically Catholics that didn't concur with what he thought was right. And he just wiped out people. And it was atrocious what he did. And, of course, the most famous thing I think about Cromwell is the fact that, you know, he was dug up 2 years after his death, hung, had his head chopped off, and the story of his head, which is a book in its own. His head basically was stuck on top of Westminster Hall for about 20 odd years and blew down in a storm, and some, I think, soldier took it home and wrapped it up and stuck it up his chimney and said, I'll have that. And it then later got passed down. It was in sort of these freak shows and things, and I think around 1962 a family got hold of it and they gave it back to Sydney Sussex College in Cambridge, which is where he'd studied, albeit for a very short time, because he went to university at Cambridge and his father died. And so I think he only had about 10 months of his education. Then he had to come home and assume the role of head of the household because he was the oldest. And the head was there, I think, for quite a while before they announced to the world that they'd got it. And it's secretly buried in Sydney Sussex College. And I think I'm right in saying that only 3 people know exactly where. And when one of those people die, it's passed on to another sort of don or founder or important person at the college. I'm saying that. I'm pretty sure it's in the chapel.
Probably. It just goes to show, though, that, I mean, you know, this brings me on to something that's been, I wasn't going to talk about this, but it bugs me how people have such a black and white view of people from history. That you can have someone who's done abysmal things, but then some of what they've done is actually quite pioneering. You know, and it's this complete black and white. Yeah, there are bad people in history. Hitler, bad person. I can't think of a good thing he did. But there are people who did things which at the time were classed as acceptable, albeit bordering on very wrong, but they were acceptable at the time. Yet, you know, now they're being almost vilified for what they did. But you've got to take it in the context of the time. And I sort of think that Cromwell definitely falls into that because some of his battle strategies from what I've read, the little I know about him,
Yes.
and you know more than I do,
Yes.
his strategies he had were pioneering. They were ahead of their time. They were
He was a brilliant military man. If you look at the various battles that took place in the Civil War, and if you go online, you can look at Wikipedia there. It'll show you how many men he had, how many men Charles I had, what the casualties were, and it was awesome that Cromwell went into battle, and using the various strategies he had, the amount of men that he slaughtered or wounded so that they couldn't fight anymore, in comparison to the casualties that his parliamentarian army absorbed. He was a brilliant military man. There's no doubt about that.
And I think the fact that he felt it was wrong that the crown could tax its subjects to the point of, well, bankruptcy, and then use it on parties and castles and fine clothes and everything else. And I think that was, revolutionary. But then also, when you're saying about what he did in Ireland, and I'm not condoning it, anyone Irish listening to this about to send me voodoo dolls and stuff, I'm not condoning it. But, for years and years and years, and again, this isn't right, the English saw the Irish as the poorer relative who were dispensable. And he was one of many for 200, 300 years who acted like that. So I just think that there's so much complexity with a lot of these people that I would love to be able to sit down with them and say, what were you looking to achieve? What was your end goal? Because I don't think it was fame. I don't think it was fortune.
Well, he turned down the crown. I mean, he basically was offered, when Charles I was out of the way, he was basically offered the crown, and he turned it down and said that he'd be Lord Protector, as opposed to so
president, in other words.
And to be honest, he's quite right, because what he'd have done if he'd have accepted the crown was accepted what he was battling against. For most of it. But
he was a man of his principles. He stuck by what his principles were, which I think is admirable.
Yeah, he was a very, very principled man. But as I said, if you speak to anybody who has Irish connections, he is absolutely hated for what he did in Ireland. And you can't deny that what he did was atrocious. What I will say about Cromwell, which has always been my thought, is he was very good at getting things done. If you gave him a job to do, good or bad, he mainly saw it through. He was very good like that.
But then when you're saying about the Irish hating Cromwell, and I understand that, the British, the English, British, whatever you want to say, haven't treated them very well for 200 years. When the fact that the nobility took the fertile part of Northern Ireland and left the Southern Islanders to starve during the potato famine, all that kind of thing. When the British sort of shot the hell out of Dublin during the Easter uprising and all those kind of things. So I can see that kind of animosity, understand it. But I think with Cromwell, he is a complex character. However, he does have quite a lot of links to our next character, who wasn't born in Huntingdon, who I believe was born in London, if I'm right.
Yes.
But whose dad lived in a place called Brampton.
No, it wasn't his dad. It was his dad's brother.
Oh, sorry, his uncle lived in Brampton. And this is the infamous and very naughty Samuel Pepys. Now, everyone's heard of the Diaries of Samuel Pepys. In fact, I was watching a programme last night that was talking about his description of the plague in 1665 in the diaries, and it's one of our few accounts that we can refer back to of what living in a plague-ridden city was actually like, and they were drawing an awful lot of parallels between what we're going through now. Now, Pepys actually would have come across Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell, I have to say, because there's more than one Cromwell. And in fact, you told me they both went to the same school.
Yeah. Peeps also was a witness to Charles I's execution.
I was about to put that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry,
that's all right.
Stealing your thunder.
You're reading my notes, aren't you, from over there? Sort of remote viewing my notes. It's that lineage of yours. That's what it is. Because one of the things we didn't mention is Mark has quite an impressive lineage. You will have heard of one of his relatives.
Well, I don't know whether you will have heard of my actual relative, but my mum's sister was married to a guy called Trevor Kenwood. Trevor Kenwood was a long-term member of the Ghost Club, and Trevor's cousin was Peter Underwood.
There you go.
I was fortunate enough to meet twice. Once, very briefly. The second time, I spent a whole afternoon with him. Incidentally, Penny, in that pub I spoke to you about, the Anchor Hotel.
Yeah.
That was my one real meeting with Peter, and I learned quite a lot from him.
When it was a sex club?
No, it wasn't a sex club then. It was the Anchor Hotel at Tempsford. And we spent... Peter Underwood, I think, originally came from Letchworth. I'm sure he said he got family or links with Letchworth. And my uncle was up here from Verwood in Dorset with his wife, Marilyn, my mum's sister, visiting her mum and dad. And he said, Peter's at Letchworth. We're going to meet him. Would you like to meet him, Mark? So I said, well, yeah. I must admit, I didn't really realise how famous he was. But I think he was president of the Ghost Club for about 32 years. And then there was some disagreement, and he split away and started his own Ghost Club society.
Yeah. No, it's pretty impressive. It's a pretty impressive connection. But sorry, the joke about the Anchor Hotel, we were talking about this off air, and it had been used during World War II to house the spies, the SOE operatives, who were about to fly out to France and everything. But Mark was telling me it's now a sex club. So
I shouldn't think it's getting much business at the moment, Penny.
Yeah, it's a bit hard to socially distance. I have thought, but anyway. But that's interesting that we have that link because of Samuel Pepys. Now, one of the things I actually genuinely did not know about Pepys was, well, let's just say if he had been around now, he'd have probably been up on quite a few assault charges. He was a bit of a philanderer.
It certainly was.
Yeah, and in fact, there's even in one of the bits in one of his diaries, he actually proudly says how he groped his maid while she was dressing him in the morning, and thinking she'd have probably had to put up with that. If he'd done that to me as his maid now, he would have got punched in the face and told in no uncertain terms that I was quitting. But obviously, 400 years ago, they probably couldn't really do that. But he was well known for having affairs. His poor wife, who was only a child when they married. But he was actually quite an intelligent guy, and he did also, as we say, have very strong links to Brampton. But what is it with the Peeps family and burying stuff?
Right, well...
You know what I'm alluding to?
Yes, I do. I know exactly what you're alluding to. There was a couple of... The thing about Pepys is obviously he's famous for his diaries, and people seem to think that he kept diaries forever and ever. He actually only kept diaries for 9 years, from 1660 to 1669. And the reason he's so famous is because of certain events that happened in that period. There was Dutch invading England. They were literally sailing up the Thames. There was obviously the Great Plague, 1664-65, and then obviously the Great Fire of London.
Yeah.
Now, Pepys, if you've read his diaries, it is meticulously detailed. And so he wrote all this down, and it's really the only really concise writing that we have of these really important events in English history. So that's why he's famous. But, yes, as regards burying things, I believe when the Dutch were invading, under threat of invading London, he told his wife... and his father to take all their money, gold, etc., and get it out of London. And they brought it 60 miles north to Brampton, where his uncle lived, and they were to bury it in the paddock at the back of his uncle's cottage, which still exists. It's called Pepys Cottage. And there's also a famous story, I think it was the fire, where he buried a wheel of Parmesan cheese.
And wine. Wine. It was a cheese and wine evening underground.
Obviously, they were very valuable things at that time, Parmesan cheese especially. And so he buried it. But if you actually go to the village of Brampton today and look at the village sign, you'll see a picture of Peeps on the sign, sort of scratching around in the ground, because his wife and his father buried this gold. Well, they didn't bury it in one place; they buried it all over the show, and then forgot where some of it was. So I know that in about the 80s, when metal detectors turned up, there was all these people going around this paddock at the back of this Peeps cottage, obviously looking for Pepys's gold. And interestingly, the church that's there, St Mary Magdalene Church, has a huge extension on the cemetery at the back of it. And a lot of people think that the gold might actually have been buried there. Whether it was or not, I don't know. But there has been, and it's explained in my book, a figure that resembles Pepys in looks, a ghost seen in St Mary Magdalene Church. He's also said to haunt the Black Bull pub, which is next door. Now, we do know that he frequented both places because it's in his diaries, because he wrote everything down.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah, so that was actually what I was leading. Well, I mean, you'd think we'd planned this, but that was exactly where I was hoping you were going to go with my comment about why do they bury everything. So well done. Well, it's nice when the guest is thinking the same way that I am. So he did come across Oliver Cromwell. Like you say, he attended the execution of Charles I, and at the time, he was very pro Cromwell's sort of stand, if you like. But he did actually change his mind, didn't he? He started to become more of a royalist, as did the Lord Earl of Sandwich, is it Edward or Edmund? I can never remember. Montague, who actually lived at Hinchingbrook House, which ironically had been owned by a Cromwell, albeit one who changed his name to Cromwell beforehand. So you've got another link there. Now, the Earl of Sandwich was Samuel's patron, his benefactor. Yeah. There's an awful lot in the diary of him going to visit Hinchingbrook, and he's always talking about my lady this and my lady that, being Sandwich's Montague's.
There's a portrait of him in there still to this day. It's a school now.
Yeah,
I went to school there in the 70s.
Now, does Mr. Peeps haunt Hinchingbrook, the house?
No, not that I'm aware of. Mainly Hinchingbrook. Hinchingbrook, there is the white lady that appears on the front cover of my book that nobody really knows who she is, and the sort of 1,000 years history of Hinchingbrook in a few seconds. It was basically a church, 10th, 11th century. There was a priory nearby, a place called Eltersley. They asked if they could convert this church, which was falling to bits, into a priory. It became a priory around 1170 and remained a priory until Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, 1536, although I think it was 1539 before it actually shut down. And it was the Cromwell family then who bought it, although, as you know, it was actually a Richard Williams who took on the name Cromwell because he was linked to the family. And they entertained James I there. When he came down to London to take the crown, he stopped off at Hinchingbrook, and he loved it there. He loved the hunting in particular, and the Cromwells. He returned frequently, and the Cromwells lavished money on him, and eventually ran out of it, which is why they had to sell it to the Montagues. The Montagues, when they purchased it, that they were there about 60 years before they were given the title Earl of Sandwich, and it was the fourth Earl that was very involved, particularly with some of Pepys's stuff. The John Montague, his name, he is the guy who's attributed in inventing the sandwich.
Yes.
He basically was a bit of a dark horse. He sponsored all Captain James Cook's voyages, and I think there's several places in the world that are named after the Montagues or Hinchingbrook
or Sandwich.
Sandwich, the Sandwich Isles. Which I think are they the Hawaiian Islands or now?
Something like that. Yeah.
He and I think there's a an island just off the, I can't remember if it's the east or west, I think it's the east coast of Australia, which is called Hinchinbrook. But funny enough, it's spelt without the E on the end. But it's in the records that Cook named it after his sponsor, which was John Montague. Montague dabbled with the paranormal. He was a member of the infamous Hellfire Club. And Peeps apparently wrote a lot of his diary entries at the back of the house on some steps, which are still there. Well, they had to be restored. They're called the Peeps Steps. But ghost-wise, Hinchinbrook is generally associated with nuns, mainly the main staircase, which is interesting because they're normally reported as only being seen from the knee up. And when I did my research on the house, I knew quite a lot of this anyway because I was at school there in the 70s and used to give tours round to the sixth form, used to give tours to earn a little bit of pocket money. Yeah. And the original staircase, or the staircase that's there now, is not the original. Yeah. The original was lost in a fire. And my theory is that the replacement staircase, which is about the same age, came from the south coast of England, out of a house there that was being dismantled or been in a fire, and they salvaged the staircase. I think the stairs are a step different to the original stairs. Yeah,
slightly different gradient or something.
Yes. Yeah. So when people see these apparitions of nuns, they're actually seeing them standing on the old staircase, and of course, they're below their knee is not visible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, perfect sense. I mean, you mentioned about Montague being into the paranormal. So was Samuel. So was Pepys.
Yes, very intrigued with it.
Yeah, there is an entry in his diaries on Christmas Day, actually, 1667, where he's talking about his wife having read him the history of the drummer of Mr. Montpesson. And he also spent the night at a place called Hill House in Chatham that was reported supposed to be haunting. And he was very interested in spells, and he did document some spells in his diaries.
Yeah, he documented them and collected them. What was interesting as well about his diaries was he wrote a lot of the diaries in code or in a foreign language. Yeah. Because he didn't want his wife to read them.
Yeah, because everything was in there. Everything was in there.
Literally, he went into it was almost pornographic. Some of it's pornographic. He wrote in there, what he did with his mistresses and stuff, and he put great detail. As he did, he wrote everything in great detail, which is why his accounts of the plague, the Great Fire in London, and the Dutch invasion are so important in English history because they're the best, the best quality documents available. Yeah. But I did read somewhere, which is quite funny, that somebody spent a number of years breaking the codes and translating the diary, only to discover that 2 shelves above was the codes. Honestly, I read that somewhere. So this poor guy spent 2 or 3 years breaking all these codes and working out what he's actually saying. And all he had to go was 2 shelves up, and the key was there.
Typical man, didn't look properly. That's what it is. But all this thing about, Pepys, he was a dirty old man. He couldn't keep it in his trousers or his breeches or whatever they would have been called. But he was still quite a benevolent character. I mean, when you look at places like Christ's Hospital, which isn't actually a hospital, it's actually a school that was actually founded by Edward VI, Henry VIII's son. I mean, just looking at that, when you think how young Edward was when he took the throne, albeit for a very short time, he was quite distraught by the poverty, and I know we go back even further now, but he was quite distraught by the poverty. He was distraught by the fact that all these people didn't have anywhere to live, and he decided to donate some of the properties that his father had commandeered, if you like, after the Reformation, and one of them was a place called Christ's Hospital. And Peeps was actually one of the patrons and ended up being very heavily involved in Christ's Hospital, like raising funds, and it was actually there that they set up something to do with the Mathematical Society to help train people who were going to be working for the Navy in all the various things that they have to do, because he was also very heavily involved in the Navy as well, wasn't he? He was kind of the secretary for the...
Yeah, well the Montagues, I know John Montague, the fourth Earl of Sandwich, was Lord of the Admiralty twice. And the Montagues, as a family in general, there's one of the Montagues was actually killed in a naval battle, and if you go into the library at Hinchinbrook House, there is a stained glass window at one end of which sort of commemorates this battle, and it's like a memorial really to him. But yeah, the Montagues were very, very much a naval family.
Yeah.
And he became secretary to the Admiralty basically. So he would be, if he was living at his uncle's house, or he did spend a great deal of his time in Huntingdonshire.
Yeah.
Literally from Peeps Cottage to Hinchinbrook House, half a mile.
Yeah.
Barely, perhaps 3/4 of a mile. It's just literally up the road. It's a short walk. His portrait is in Hinchinbrook, and the Peeps steps are there at the back of the property. They do allow people to go in there. They still do it, I think, in the months of June and July, when the kids have broken up and they're on the summer holidays. You can book to go in there on a Sunday. I think it's a £5, and they give you a piece of cake and a cup of tea afterwards. And one of the sort of what we called sixth form pupils in my day will walk you around and tell you some of the house's history, show you the skeletons under the staircase and everything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting place. And I mean, with Peeps, he lived in London, but when you look at it, even though it's only for sort of a few years his diary was kept, I looked it up and I did a search in it for Brampton, and there's hundreds of entries talking about Brampton, whether it was his wife going to visit his uncle there, or whether he was going to visit the uncle to then go to see Montague, all that. So yes, he was definitely there, and an awful lot. But his main residence was really in London, and he lived at 12 Buckingham Street.
Yeah.
For something like 8-9 years, and then he moved to number 14, and supposedly his ghost is seen staring out the window
on the stairs.
14.
Yeah, on the stairs, I think, Penny.
I read it that he was staring out the window, but it could be more than one apparition, shall we say.
I can't remember the address of the property, but I know there's a property in London where his ghost was allegedly seen on the stairs, I believe. But I didn't really take too much notice, because when I was writing the book, I was focused on Huntingdonshire, obviously.
Yeah.
But in Huntingdonshire, he's supposed to haunt the Black Bull pub, which he definitely in his diaries drank in. And next door, there's a cemetery where he's supposed to be walking, looking down at the ground and looking agitated, which sort of coincides with the village sign, which shows him searching for his missing gold.
Yeah.
He definitely worshipped, as did the Montagues, in St Mary Magdalene Church, which is the closest church to both Peeps Cottage and Hinchinbrook House, and right next door to the Black Bull.
Yeah. Yeah, so he's got a very strong attachment to the area. But in a way, as have you to the area, the sort of parish of Huntingdonshire, because your 4 generations of your family have lived in, how do you pronounce it, South Hoe?
South Hoe, yeah. It's a small village. It's basically halfway between Huntingdon and St Neots. We're about 7 miles from Huntingdon and 4 to 5 miles from St Neots, right on the A1. You can't miss it.
So tell me about Fred.
Oh, God, yeah, this is the house where I sit now. This was my father built this house in 1964. He was a bricklayer. We lived immediately next door, not in the house that's there now. That was knocked down, an old thatched cottage long ago. But we moved into this house in 1964, new building, and my mother had an incident where she woke up in the night and saw what appeared to be a smock-frocked yokel standing at the end of her bed, sort of looking out the window and sort of holding his belly as if he was, head back, holding his belly as if he was laughing. And she was very frightened, and she ducked under the covers and woke my father up, who wasn't too pleased, got up, looked around the whole house and could find absolutely nothing. And then we had a lot of instances happen in the house of what you would call poltergeist activity. Not so much noises and bangs, mainly things going missing that would then turn up 2-3 weeks later in the most obvious type of places. So I never ever saw him, but around about 10 years after my mother's incident, we had a painter and decorator in by the name of Michael Gadsby, and he was decorating the dining room, and the dining room's got an open staircase in it that leads upstairs, and he saw a man at the top of the stairs and thought my mother was upstairs as well, and called up the stairs, and she was actually in the living room. And so she said, there's someone up your stairs, and they went upstairs together armed with the poker from the fire. Again, no sight, but then when he described what he'd seen, he said it was a man with a funny hat, and he basically described exactly what my mother had seen. But the main things that would happen was poltergeist activity. Things would go missing. The house didn't have central heating in it, and my mother used to put clean underwear on the airing cupboard sometimes, on the boiler, on the immersion heater, so that when she got up in the morning, she got warm underwear. And a couple of occasions it would go missing, and it just disappear off the face of the earth. And then 3 or 4 weeks later, it would turn up. I remember we had something go missing. It turned up on top of the TV, in places that you couldn't possibly miss it. I was very young, so this was hidden from me. I didn't know anything about it. And I had a couple of experiences. I started to realise that things that happened when I was about 14, 15 were not actually logically explained. But up until that point, they kept quiet and didn't tell me about it. But I had somebody come in who was, I left when I was 19, and I moved back in here. My mother died in 2010, and I moved back here in 2013. And I rented it out for a while, and the girl who was here had a couple of strange things occur, and I didn't want to frighten her and tell her too much, because my mum got to call this ghost Fred. He wasn't nasty or anything. He was mischievous.
Yeah.
And she used to just joke. If something went missing, she'd say, "Stop it, Fred. Bring it back. I need it." And it, 9 times out of 10, it would reappear.
Yeah.
The next day or something like that. And he would disappear for months and months on end, nothing, and then suddenly sort of come back. But we discovered that the house. Well, my parents knew, I didn't, because where our house is, there was a row of four cottages. Thatched cottages. They were farm workers' cottages. So we made the assumption, because of the way people had seen him and had explained it, that he was a farm worker in the local village. And I actually got, when I came back here, a creditable medium to come in and tell me if they picked up anything. And I did give him a bit of background information, and he said, it doesn't relate to your property, it relates to the property that was here before. He said he's not. He says, I don't think he's a farm labourer. He said, I think he was actually like a foreman, and he's sort of a middleman between the farmer and the farm workers. And he said that he's a mischievous chap. He said, a bit of a ladies' man, and he said, I get this really strong impression of him coming home on the back of a hay cart, absolutely paralytic. And he said, he's a harmless character. He's not going to do you any harm. When we moved back here, we had one strange incident happen, and that was in 2013, and we've not had anything since. And it sort of harked back to something that runs through my book. You'll know because you read it, that I've found that sort of paranormal activity can very often remain dormant, and then when you get new people in a property, or those people start knocking walls around, not painting and decorating, but changing the structure, it almost sort of brings it out again. So I sort of made a reference to the stone tape theory and stuff, and it's interesting, but unproven.
Yeah, no, I'm a big believer in that. I mean, one of the questions somebody says it's suddenly all kicking off. It's like, what have you had done? Or I've had a new bathroom put in, or I've done an extension, or my daughter's boyfriend has moved in with us now, or something like that. You can normally see what the catalyst
something changes which causes it. about.
Yeah.
Normally, I think it's new people or altering the structure.
Yeah.
I would say I occasionally get called out to places where people are a bit worried. We've got stuff happening. Can you come and have a look, Mark? And I go out and have a look. And when you interview them, I would say 90% of the time that they've either not been there very long, or they've done major structural work in the house.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I've seen that too. So we're nearly at the end of the interview, Mark.
Yes.
And now you say you've got an impressive lineage there with your connections to the awesome Mr. Peter Underwood. You've been doing this for a long time. There's an awful lot of groups now springing up doing online training and stuff. And I'm not talking about, I know people like Jane Harris do it, Barry Guy, and their stuff is very good. And I know for a fact Jane's is fully accredited and everything else. But, I get a lot of people who want to get into the paranormal and they want to learn how to investigate. And they say, should I do one of these courses? Should I do this? Should I do that? I know what my advice is to them. It's normally, I personally wouldn't, but my advice is just experience as much as you can, because you can learn it all from a book, but it's not the same. What would your advice be to someone who wants to, because we need new blood coming in. Obviously, we always need new people coming in. I'm not a snob. I'm not one of those people who say, we don't need any new people. As long as those new people come in with the right attitude, What would your advice be to them if they wanted to start?
I think that you have to be extremely careful, because there are a lot of people out there, particularly at this moment with this virus going around. I've had a couple of emails sent to me offering me online courses in mediumship with a qualification at the end of it for 25 quid. And I've had other people that want to teach you how to ghost hunt and stuff like that. And to be quite honest, you will find, in my experience, 40-odd years of doing various paranormal investigations, not only on my own but with other people or with other groups, there is vast differences in how people operate.
Yeah.
But if someone's offering you a qualification, I would be wanting to know who's it accredited to and things like that, because there's so many people about that. I knew one gentleman who was training people under the resume that he had an accreditation with ASAP, and he actually didn't. And he was charging them 30 to 40 quid a time for this training, which he said was required by and accredited to. And
that's wrong.
when it was looked into, it basically he hadn't been involved with ASAP since 2004. That ended up in a court case in Cambridge. Good. And I had to go and give evidence.
Good.
And he was found out and stuff like that. But if you get people and they're telling you that, I would look at their qualifications very, very, very carefully.
I'm of the opinion, I don't know how you can be qualified in this area, because of you can. It's like when someone says they're a paranormal expert comes in.
Yes.
I kind of roll my eyes and walk away. And to be fair, it's not normally them that says it. It's the television show or whatever that says it. And the individual themselves hate the fact they call them that. I think you can be an expert in history, because you can double check the information. You can be an expert in photography. You can be an expert in, I don't know how I'd put it, but sound. So you can measure wavelengths and all that kind of thing. But my personal thing for the paranormal is, if there's a specialist area of it you want to learn how to, whether it be the history side like I do, whether it be the photography side, whether it be the sound side, whether it be the psychology side, yes, there's so much you can do to learn about those. But a lot of it is just down to getting out there and doing it.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I wouldn't ever paint myself to be an expert, even though I've been doing it for 40 plus years. I mean, I haven't been doing it solid. I got married, I had small children, and doing paranormal investigations is not conducive when you've got small children waking you up at 6 o'clock in the morning. You've just got in at 4. But I think that I've got a lot of experience, but I wouldn't say that my way and the way I do investigations is the correct way. or not the correct way. I hear the word para-unity used a lot, and I understand that. Be friends, share information and that, but there's a lot of things that I see in investigations, and I think, well, I don't think that's credible, and I can give a valid reason as to why not. But I don't want to get into an argument with them if that's what they do and that's how they do it, and they enjoy it. Because
that's the important thing. That is, my thing is to be respectful.
Yes.
Don't start a row when there's no need to start a row.
I respect everybody, and
I'm talking about with spirits here. I'm not talking necessarily fellow investigators. I'm talking about with spirits. That's my personal viewpoint. I don't go in all guns blazing, like trying to provoke a response, because that's not the kind.
I definitely feel strongly about that.
Yeah,
you have to be respectful. Very often, when I do investigations and we seem to have made a link and seem to be communicating, one of the things that I always do. So I ask the question, are you happy here? And if they are, I leave them be. If they're not, I say, would you like us to try and to help you, get somewhere else? And whether you do or not, you've got no proof as such. But I did that last Sunday, actually, on an investigation that I was involved in. I would never evoke anything. And one thing as well that Peter Underwood taught me, he said to me, I can remember this vividly. This was in the back garden of what's now the sex club. He said, don't do lone vigils. He said they all look very attractive for TV, and it adds to the atmosphere. He says you don't know what you're dealing with, and he said if you need any help, you've got no one to help you. And he said most importantly, he said if you get anything, you've got nobody else there to witness it. So if you've got one or more other people with you and they see it too and experience too, the credibility is much, much greater. And he was spot on with that, and that's why I was saying to you when I was in the Cromwell Museum with a small team, what we experienced in there, what I liked about that investigation was we weren't allowed in there because of the priceless items that are in that museum belonging to Cromwell. So we had a curator watching, and they observed it too.
Yeah.
So we had an independent witness who was just basically there to make sure we didn't damage anything. And, he witnessed that as well. But I'd be very, very careful with paranormal training. It's a bit like, I don't know, you are mediums and things. I think, when people sort of, especially if they've had a bereavement and they decide they want to deal with a medium, be very, very careful. Ask around and make sure that person, has got a good reputation and stuff like that. Really dig into it. Don't take one person's word for it. Take your time.
Don't take things at face value.
No, because unfortunately there are a lot of people out there that, that they're either their own... there's financial gains for them to be made, or there is, their own ego is boosted by, making you believe that they can do something that you can't. And so, you've got to be careful.
But luckily, there's an awful lot of very decent people out there in this business. There's an awful lot of very interesting people that you can learn from, like yourself. So I would like to say thank you ever so much for being my guest on this episode of Haunted Histories, Mark. I know your book's available on Amazon.
Yes, it's on Amazon in the Kindle format. And if the book's got a website, so if you go to the website, you'll see where you can buy it online, hardback copy.
Yeah. And you've got your Haunted History, not Haunted Histories like me, but Haunted History in the singular page on Facebook as well, where you post all your sort of various exploits and things to do. There's two groups. I run a group which is called the Haunted History of Huntingdonshire, and everything in there is Huntingdonshire based. And then the other one is called Haunted Histories. And no, it's not Haunted Histories.
Haunted History, much like the book. The book's got 300 photographs in it and illustrations, and my articles, I tend to write 300 to 500 words on a place, a little bit of history, a little bit of information about the hauntings, but then lots of pictures. And it seems popular. People seem to like it.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, like I say, that's been Mark Egerton from Huntingdonshire. If you want to grab a copy of his book, do so. Go and have a look at his Facebook pages as well, because I say I learned stuff on the history, and I'm sure he would agree that he's learned stuff off my pages as well. It's all there to share and to learn from each other. But that brings me to the end of the show. So thank you ever so much for listening. If you do have any questions for Mark or for myself, do feel free to message me on the Haunted Histories page and I'll pass them on. But until next time, my friends, have a good evening, sleep tight, and don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.